The dry run, an Olympian's fatal hack. Imagine finding a body in the middle of the Mojave Desert in mid-July. The ambient temperature is hovering around 112 degrees. The air is so dry, it feels like it's pulling the moisture straight out of your lungs. When local sheriffs found the man, they assumed it was just another tragic case of a hiker underestimating the elements. But then they realized who it was. Marcus Vance, a world-class Olympic distance runner. A guy whose entire life was built on surviving extreme physical stress. And honestly, that wasn't even the strangest part. The medical examiner noticed something at the scene that made absolutely zero sense. Marcus had collapsed after covering nearly 18 miles on foot. But his high-tech running shirt? It was bone dry. Not a single drop of sweat. How does an Olympian run 18 miles in a literal furnace and not sweat? The answer to that question is the exact reason he's dead. And it all started with a simple, fatal mistake. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. Let's rewind a bit. 6 months earlier, Marcus isn't a cautionary tale. He's just a guy sitting at his kitchen island in a quiet suburb of Henderson, Nevada. You know, the kind of house stucco exterior, perfectly manicured gravel lawn, the constant low hum of central AC keeping the brutal desert out. Marcus is 28. He's got that lean, almost fragile look that elite marathoners have. Every morning starts exactly the same way. 4:30 a.m., the smell of cheap, dark roast coffee, and a glowing laptop screen. He's obsessed with the data. Heart rate variability, VO2 max, fluid retention. He missed the podium at the last games by 14 seconds. 14 seconds. That kind of failure doesn't just motivate a guy like Marcus, it haunts him. It eats at him while he's paying bills, while he's doing the dishes. He was convinced that his body's natural cooling system, sweating, was his biggest liability. Sweating meant losing water, losing electrolytes, losing precious seconds at aid stations. So he started looking for a shortcut. A way to cheat biology. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. It's a Tuesday morning in late June. Marcus is out on a desolate stretch of Route 167 miles outside of town. The asphalt is already shimmering with heat waves by 8 a.m. He's wearing an experimental transdermal patch he procured online, something supposedly designed for military operatives to suppress sweat gland activity and retain core hydration. He's 10 miles into his run. The pacing is incredible. He feels light, almost invincible. But then, something shifts. It's subtle at first, just a faint, high-pitched ringing in his left ear. He brushes it off, thinking it's just the altitude or the dry air. But he isn't dehydrated, is he? He checks his smartwatch. His heart rate is spiking, jumping from 145 to 178 inches a matter of seconds. And then, the strangest sensation hits him. In the middle of a 105-degree desert, baking under a relentless sun, Marcus suddenly feels cold. A deep, bone-rattling chill. He stops running, hands resting on his knees, gasping for air. He looks down at his arms. Goosebumps. He's standing there on the shoulder of Route 167, a ribbon of cracked asphalt surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and the blinding glare of the Nevada desert. He's shivering. In 105-degree heat. Now, any normal person would have stopped right there. They would have flagged down one of those passing snowbird RVs headed toward Lake Mead, or at the very least, found a patch of shade under a billboard to call for help. But you have to understand the mindset of an elite athlete. To Marcus, pain isn't a warning sign, it's just data. It's a hurdle to be optimized. He stands there for a moment, hands on his knees, watching a bead of moisture roll down his water bottle. It's the only moisture in sight. He rubs his arms, feeling the raised goosebumps. And honestly, at that point, it made perfect sense to him to just rationalize it away. He tells himself, it's the pre-workout supplement. That morning, around 4:30 a.m., he had dry scooped a new, aggressive nitric oxide booster. He recalls reading on some obscure bodybuilding forum that heavy doses of beta-alanine and caffeine can cause extreme peripheral vasoconstriction, basically your blood vessels shrinking, pulling blood away from the surface of your skin to flood your deep muscle tissue. That's it, he thinks. It's just the pre-workout. My body is just prioritizing the muscles. It's a logical explanation. It fits the data he wants to believe. So, Marcus does what he's been trained to do his entire life. He pushes through. He checks his Garmin watch, resets his posture, and starts running again. And for the next 2 miles, it actually looks like he was right. If you look at the GPS and pacing data recovered from his smartwatch later that week, his split times didn't just stabilize, they improved. He was flying. He hits a sub-6-minute mile. A dusty, white Ford F-150 rattles past him, the driver tapping the brakes to look at the lone runner braving the midday furnace. Marcus just throws up a casual thumbs up. He feels a sudden, massive surge of energy. A runner's high, he's light, focused, and completely dialed in. The experimental patch is working, he's retaining all his water, he's cheating biology, but the truth was, he wasn't cheating biology at all. Biology was just preparing him for the end. That massive surge of energy, that runner's high, it wasn't a second wind. It was his sympathetic nervous system slamming the panic button. His brain was dumping every ounce of adrenaline it had left because it realized something Marcus hadn't. His internal organs were beginning to cook. The illusion shatters around mile 14. The ringing in his ears returns, but this time, it's not a faint hum, it's a deafening roar, like standing next to a jet engine. The horizon, that shimmering line of desert heat, suddenly tilts 45 degrees to the left. Marcus stumbles, his expensive carbon-plated running shoes catching on the gravel shoulder. He barely catches himself. He looks down at his Garmin watch, but the numbers are swimming. The screen is a blur of meaningless pixels. He feels a wave of profound, terrifying confusion. He reaches up to wipe the sweat from his forehead, a deeply ingrained reflex. But his hand drags across dry skin. It's not just dry, it's hot. Burning hot. Like touching the hood of a car left out in the August sun. The false explanation collapses in an instant. It wasn't the pre-workout. It wasn't vasoconstriction. The transdermal patch hadn't just suppressed his sweat glands, it had entirely paralyzed his body's thermoregulatory system. His core temperature was blowing past 104 degrees, climbing toward a fatal 106. The human body is an engine, and Marcus had intentionally disabled the radiator. Panic sets in. Not the frantic, flailing kind of panic, but a deep, primal terror. The kind where your brain physically cannot process the malfunction. Marcus's hands start shaking violently. He reaches for his left shoulder, clawing at his compression shirt to get to the experimental patch. His fingers are clumsy, thick, and uncoordinated. He manages to peel the fabric back and scrapes at the clear adhesive square. N, but it's military grade. It's designed to withstand triathlons, ocean swims, and extreme friction. It won't budge. He tears at his own skin, leaving bloody, dry scratches across his collarbone, but his motor skills are rapidly degrading. The desert around him is completely, unnervingly silent, save for the sound of his own ragged, dry breathing and the crunch of gravel under his knees. He collapses. The impact is heavy, unbraced. A cloud of fine, white Nevada dust kicks up around him. On his wrist, his Garmin watch emits a cheerful, high-pitched chirp, auto-pausing his workout because he stopped moving. And honestly, this is where the story shifts from a tragic accident to a terrifying medical reality. The driver of that dusty white Ford F-150, he had a weird feeling. He was a local, a guy who drove that stretch of highway every day, and he knew that nobody runs out there at 1 p.m. in July. He turned around about 20 minutes later. He found Marcus lying in the dirt, face up, staring blankly at the blinding sun. When the EMTs arrived, they didn't know what they were dealing with. The paramedics assumed it was standard severe dehydration. They tried to take his core temperature, but the standard digital thermometer they carried in the rig maxed out. It just flashed an error code. By the time they life-flighted him to the nearest trauma center in Vegas, his internal temperature was recorded at a fatal 107.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The autopsy report. It's not an easy read. I've looked through the coroner's notes, the toxicology screens, all the messy, bureaucratic paperwork of death. It turns out the transdermal patch wasn't just a localized antiperspirant. It contained a highly concentrated, experimental anticholinergic compound. It didn't just tell his sweat glands to stop producing moisture, it chemically blockaded the neurotransmitters responsible for his parasympathetic nervous system. And he didn't just stop sweating. His body literally forgot how times to sweat. By trying to cheat his way past hydration limits, Marcus had essentially locked himself inside a burning building and thrown away the key. His liver, his kidneys, his central nervous system, they all cooked in his own trapped body heat. The ultimate biohack for survival became the exact instrument of his death. Endpoint N, which brings us to the final, haunting piece of this puzzle. Endpoint N, when investigators bagged his personal effects, they tossed his Garmin watch into an evidence locker. A few weeks later, a forensic tech downloaded the data to map his final route. The GPS track showed his incredible pace, the sudden stop, the collapse. N. But the watch didn't stop recording when Marcus did. N. If you pull up the raw data file from that afternoon, there's a specific timestamp. 1:14 p.m. That's when Marcus hit the ground. You can see his heart rate spike to 195 beats per minute in sheer physiological terror, flutter erratically, and then flatline, drop to 0. But the biosensors kept running. For another 4 hours, the watch sat there on his lifeless wrist, baking in the desert sun, dutifully logging the ambient temperature as it climbed to 112 degrees. Marcus spent his entire life trying to conquer human limitation. He viewed his body as a machine that could be optimized, overridden, and hacked. But biology doesn't negotiate. When you permanently silence your body's warning systems, it doesn't mean the danger is gone. It just means you won't know you're dying. Until the engine melts down completely. The Vending Machine King, a hit in suburbia. Honestly, if you ask any veteran homicide detective in Bergen County about the Vance case, they will all tell you the exact same thing. It looked exactly like a professional hit. A message. NN. When you walk into a house and find a husband and wife face down in their own dining room, each with two caliber bullets to the back of the head, and a stack of $50 bills left completely untouched on the kitchen counter, your brain automatically goes to organized crime. It just makes sense. You don't leave cash behind unless the murder is the entire point. NN. But before we get into the blood, the theories, and the sheer procedural mess this case became, we need to talk about Arthur and Helen Vance. Because to understand why this crime didn't make any sense, you have to understand how spectacularly normal they were. Arthur was 68. He owned a regional chain of vending machines, a cash-heavy business, sure, which is exactly why the police initially leaned so hard into the mafia theory. But Arthur wasn't a mobster. He was a guy who wore New Balance sneakers to church and spent his weekends obsessing over the pH levels of his lawn. Helen, 65, was a retired middle school math teacher. They lived in a sprawling 4,000-square-foot colonial at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in northern New Jersey. The kind of neighborhood where the biggest scandal is usually someone leaving their trash cans out a day too long. They drank Folgers coffee, they watched Jeopardy every night at 7 p.m. They were the physical embodiment of the American suburban dream. And which brings us to Tuesday, October 14th. It was the kind of crisp, overcast fall day where everyone is just going about their routine. But the Vance's next-door neighbor, a retired postal worker named Gary, noticed something that made him pause. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't the sound of breaking glass. It was water. The Vance's lawn sprinklers had been running since Sunday night. The driveway was completely flooded, water cascading down into the storm drain. And sitting right there at the end of the driveway, soaking wet and disintegrating into mush, was the Sunday paper. Then, Gary noticed the mail. 3 days' worth of junk mail and envelopes jammed into the brass slot on the front door. Gary walked over, his shoes squishing in the saturated grass. He figured maybe they had gone out of town to visit their grandkids in Ohio and forgot to set the sprinkler timer. He rang the doorbell. Nothing. He knocked on the heavy oak door. Silence. But as he leaned in, intending to peek through the sidelight window, he noticed the door wasn't fully latched. It was cracked open, maybe half an inch. In. And honestly, this is the moment Gary's life changed forever. Because when he pushed that door open, he wasn't met with the familiar smell of Helen's baking or the scent of fresh laundry. He was hit by a wall of cold air from the AC running on overdrive, mixed with the unmistakable, heavy metallic scent of dried blood and stale coffee. Gary didn't step past the entryway. He didn't need to. Just a few feet into the foyer, past a perfectly placed welcome mat, he saw a single beige New Balance sneaker. It was attached to Arthur's leg, which was protruding from the archway of the formal dining room. Underneath that sneaker was a dark, tacky pool of crimson that had seeped into the grout of the ceramic tiles. Gary backed out slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, and dialed 911 from his heavy Motorola cell phone. When the first patrol cars arrived, their sirens cutting through the quiet suburban morning, the officers found a scene that felt fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the violence. It was the juxtaposition of the violence against the utterly mundane backdrop of a Sunday morning routine. Helen Vance was found in the kitchen. She was still wearing her quilted pink bathrobe. A half-eaten blueberry bagel sat on a ceramic plate on the island, right next to the Sunday crossword puzzle, half filled out in her neat, cursive handwriting. Arthur was in his home office down the hall. Both of them had been shot twice in the back of the head. Execution style. And honestly, if you're a homicide detective in northern New Jersey in the late 90s, and you walk into a house where a business owner has been executed with double taps to the back of the head, your brain immediately goes to one place. At that point, it made perfect sense. Arthur owned a regional vending machine empire. If you know anything about the East Coast vending business, you know it's a cash-heavy industry. Quarters, dimes, crinkled dollar bills, it's an ocean of untraceable currency. For decades, it had been a prime target for organized crime infiltration, money laundering, and territorial disputes. Detective Ray Miller, a 20-year veteran who looked like he survived entirely on black coffee and antacids, took one look at the scene and called it. "This is a hit," he told the responding officers. And for the first 48 hours, the entire police department operated on that exact assumption. It was a clean, logical narrative that explained the unexplainable. There was no forced entry, meaning whoever came in either had a key or was let in. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned lamps, no broken picture frames, and most importantly, there was no robbery. Helen's $15,000 diamond anniversary ring was still on her left hand. Arthur's gold Rolex was still ticking on his wrist. A stack of $200 in 20s sat untouched on the entryway table. Hitmen don't care about your Rolex. They care about the contract. The police threw everything they had at the mafia theory. They subpoenaed Arthur's business records looking for loan sharks, gambling debts, or union disputes. They brought in rival vending machine operators for aggressive, hours-long interrogations. They scoured the neighborhood for reports of suspicious black Lincoln Town cars idling by the curb. But here's the thing about a logical narrative. It only works until the physical evidence starts screaming at you. As the crime scene technicians painstakingly processed the 4,000-square-foot colonial, the professional hit theory didn't just crack it completely shattered. It started with the ballistics. When the medical examiner extracted the slugs from Arthur and Helen, they weren't 9mm rounds. They weren't 38 specials or heavy duty. They weren't 45S. They were 22 caliber long rifle bullets. .22 is a squirrel gun. It's a target shooting round. It's notorious for jamming and lacking stopping power. No self-respecting mob contractor is walking into a double homicide with a .22 caliber pistol. It's too unpredictable. Then there was the timeline, which was a procedural mess. The coroner placed the time of death somewhere between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Sunday. But the neighbors didn't hear any gunshots, which initially suggested a silencer, another point for the hitman theory. But a .22 fired inside a large, heavily insulated house with the windows closed and the AC blasting, you wouldn't hear it from the street anyway. But the detail that truly broke the detectives, the clue that kept Detective Miller awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling, was found in the kitchen and the laundry room. Remember the stale coffee Gary smelled? The crime scene techs found a standard drip coffee maker on the counter. The pot was half full. The burner was left on so long the glass had scorched. Next to it was a ceramic mug with a single faint smudge of a latex glove on the handle. Someone had brewed a fresh pot of Folgers Times after Times shooting Helen and Arthur. They had stood in that kitchen, feet away from Helen's body, and casually drank a cup of coffee. And then the techs opened the laundry room door. Inside was Buster, the Vances' 12-year-old golden retriever. He wasn't harmed. In fact, he was resting comfortably on his dog bed. Next to him was a freshly filled bowl of water and exactly 2 level scoops of Purina dog food in his dish. A mafia enforcer doesn't stick around to brew a pot of Folgers. A cold-blooded hitman doesn't take the time to carefully measure out dog food to ensure the family pet doesn't go hungry over the weekend. The realization hit the precinct like a bucket of ice water. They weren't looking for a professional killer from the 5 families. They were looking for someone who felt right at home. When you realize the killer is someone who knows where the dog food is kept, the entire investigation flips on its axis. And honestly, for Detective Miller, this was the moment the case went from a high-profile puzzle to something deeply, intensely ugly. They stopped looking at offshore accounts and disgruntled business partners. They started looking inward. They looked at the Vances' inner circle, and it didn't take long for the spotlight to fall on their only son, Julian. Julian was 29, living in a high-end condo in Boston, about 200 miles away from the New Jersey suburbs. When he was brought in for questioning, he played the part of the grieving son perfectly. He was tearful, cooperative, and frankly, he seemed terrified of the mob hit theory. He told police he had been in his apartment all weekend, binge-watching television and ordering takeout. But here is where the procedural messiness of real life trips up even the most cold-blooded plans. Julian was smart enough to leave his cell phone in Boston so it wouldn't ping any towers near his parents' house. He was smart enough to use an untraceable .22 caliber pistol. But he wasn't smart enough to account for the little plastic transponder on his windshield. Investigators pulled the EZ Pass records for his silver Subaru Outback. At 5:14 a.m. on Sunday morning, his car registered at a toll plaza on I-84, heading south. At 10:42 a.m., it pinged again, heading north. When Miller dropped that printout on the interrogation table, Julian didn't break down. He didn't cry. The grieving son act vanished, replaced by a blank, empty stare that Miller later described as looking into a dry well. Which brings us to what police believe actually happened that Sunday morning. It's about 8:15 a.m. Julian parks a block away from his childhood home. He walks across the damp suburban grass, unlocks the back door with his own key, and steps inside. Buster, the golden retriever, doesn't bark. He just wags his tail at the familiar face. Arthur is in the den, reading the Sunday paper. Julian walks up behind him, raises the gun, and pulls the trigger twice. Helen hears the noise and steps out of the master bedroom. Julian turns and fires once, and then comes the part that still haunts the detectives. Julian didn't panic. He didn't flee into the morning mist. He went into the kitchen, put on a pair of latex gloves, and brewed a pot of Folgers. Why? Because he had a 3-hour drive back to Boston, and he needed the caffeine. It wasn't some bizarre psychological ritual. It was chillingly practical. While the coffee was dripping, he noticed Buster's water bowl was low. So he filled it. He methodically measured out 2 level scoops of Purina. He poured his coffee into a ceramic mug, left the burner on, and walked out the door. The motive? It wasn't a multi-million-dollar mob debt. Julian had lost his tech job 6 months prior, was secretly facing foreclosure, and his parents had recently refused to give him another loan, telling him it was time he learned financial responsibility. He killed them for a $1.2 million life insurance policy and a colonial house. For the community, the truth was a devastating blow. The mafia hit theory, as terrifying as it was, had offered a weird kind of comfort. If the mob kills you, it's because you crossed a line. It means the danger is outside, separate from normal suburban life. But if your own son can shoot you in the back of the head and then make a cup of coffee in your kitchen, that shatters the illusion of safety entirely. It means the monster isn't a shadowy hitman in a Lincoln Town car. The monster is sitting at your Thanksgiving table. But the final aftershock, the detail that sticks with you long after you close the file, came from the digital forensics team. They pulled the call logs from the Vance's landline. At 11:30 a.m. on Sunday, about an hour after Julian had left the crime scene, the house phone rang. It went to the answering machine. The police have the tape. It's Julian's voice, bright and cheerful. "Hey Mom, Dad, just checking in. Hope Sunday's treating you well. Give me a call back when you get this. Love you guys." And if you listen closely to the background audio of that voicemail, beneath his cheerful tone, you can hear the rhythmic clicking of his Subaru's turn signal and the faint, distinct sound of a man taking a sip from a ceramic coffee mug. The secret ingredient of Blackwood. In July of 2019, the emergency room at St. Jude's Hospital in Blackwood, Pennsylvania, admitted 22 people in a single weekend. Every patient showed the exact same symptoms: violent nausea, cold sweats, severe hallucinations. At first, ER doctors assumed it was food poisoning, probably contaminated ground beef at a summer barbecue. But when toxicology reports came back, the results made absolutely no sense. The patients didn't have salmonella, they didn't have E. coli. Instead, their bloodstreams contained dangerously high concentrations of formaldehyde and synthetic embalming chemicals. Which raised a horrifying question. What exactly had the people of Blackwood been eating? Blackwood is the kind of town most people drive past without noticing. A fading Rust Belt community sitting just off Interstate 80. Once built on coal money, now barely surviving after the mines shut down decades ago. Its one remaining landmark was a roadside diner called the Rusty Spoon. If you lived anywhere within 50 miles, you knew the place. People drove for hours just to sit in those cracked vinyl booths and order the diner's famous Brunswick stew. Rich, savory, slow-cooked for nearly 12 hours. It had become local legend, comfort food at its finest. And honestly, when you first look through the original investigation files, nothing immediately suggests murder or conspiracy. At first, it looked like a tragic food safety violation. The county health inspector assigned to the case was a middle-aged bureaucrat named David Hiller. David's inspection notes read exactly the way you'd expect. Coffee stains across paperwork, junk mail folded between folders, tiny doodles scribbled in the margins. He wasn't some hardened detective. He was a man slowly coasting toward retirement while inspecting grease traps and expired milk cartons. Then, one sweltering Tuesday afternoon, David received a complaint. A family of 4 from Ohio had stopped at the Rusty Spoon for lunch before continuing down Interstate 80. Less than 10 miles later, they were pulled over, violently vomiting on the roadside shoulder. At the time, the explanation seemed obvious. Maybe spoiled meat, a broken refrigerator, cross-contamination in the kitchen, routine stuff. David drove out to Route 9 expecting to hand out a citation and move on with his day. At first glance, the diner looked spotless. Freezer temperatures checked out. Prep stations were clean, nothing obviously dangerous. But, standing near the back-loading entrance, David noticed something strange. First came the sound. A low electrical humming coming from a large chest freezer hidden near the alleyway. The freezer wasn't listed anywhere on the building inspection records, and it was secured with a heavy padlock. Then David noticed the smell. Not bleach, not ammonia, something sweeter. A thick chemical odor hanging heavily in the humid kitchen air, like rotting flowers mixed with raw copper. The kind of smell that coated the back of your throat. When David asked the owner, Arthur Pendleton, where his meat shipments came from, the mood inside the kitchen instantly changed. Arthur was beloved in town, soft-spoken, friendly. The kind of older man who remembered customers by name. He wiped his hands on his apron and offered a nervous smile. "Local supplier," he answered casually. But when David requested invoices, Arthur couldn't produce a single receipt covering the previous 3 months, not one. And while inspecting the prep station, David spotted something else beneath a tarp. A heavy-duty industrial bone saw, far larger than anything a roadside diner should reasonably need, and strangely, perfectly clean. You have to understand, David Hiller wasn't trained to investigate violent crimes. He inspected kitchens. Human beings naturally search for normal explanations even when something feels deeply wrong. So, David didn't call the police. He issued Arthur a $200 citation for the unregistered freezer, demanded the missing invoices by Friday, and walked back into the blazing summer heat. But he couldn't stop thinking about that smell. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation escalated quietly. More patients arrived at the ER, 4, then 12, then more. The symptoms became increasingly disturbing. Not just vomiting anymore, victims reported tremors, blurred vision, auditory hallucinations, and every single patient had recently eaten the Brunswick stew at the Rusty Spoon. Suddenly, David's office was flooded with complaints. So he returned to the diner, prepared to shut the place down completely. But when he entered the kitchen, the padlocked freezer was gone. Only a pale, rectangular outline remained on the concrete floor where it had once sat. Arthur simply smiled and explained he had thrown the old unit away. At that point, county officials believed they had solved the mystery. And honestly, the theory sounded completely reasonable. Poaching. Meat prices had skyrocketed that summer, and Arthur was known locally as a hunter. Authorities assumed he had been secretly grinding feral hog meat or illegally harvested venison into the stew to cut costs. It explained the bone saw, the missing invoices, the secrecy. People around town even joked about it. At local hardware stores, they started calling the stew Arthur's Roadkill Special. Nobody imagined the truth was worse. The entire poaching theory collapsed on a Thursday morning when David received a fax from the state toxicology lab. He later described the moment as the instant his blood turned cold. The report contained no parasites, no bacteria, no evidence of spoiled game meat. Instead, toxicologists identified massive levels of methanol, glutaraldehyde, formaldehyde. David stared at the report in silence as the pieces clicked together. Formaldehyde, that sweet chemical odor from the hidden freezer. You don't find embalming chemicals inside wild animals. There is only one reason meat tissue would contain formaldehyde. It had been preserved after death with embalming fluid. And then David remembered something buried inside Arthur Pendleton's background records. Arthur didn't just own the diner. His family owned another business nearby, Oak Hill Funeral Home, located less than 2 miles down Route 9. Arthur's older brother, Thomas Pendleton, served as the funeral director. Honestly, it's difficult to describe the kind of panic that hits when a county health inspector suddenly realizes he may have uncovered something far worse than food poisoning. David immediately called the sheriff's department. Getting a search warrant wasn't easy. The entire accusation sounded insane. It took hours of arguments, paperwork, stale precinct coffee, and jurisdiction debates before a judge finally signed off. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, Sheriff Miller and several deputies arrived at Oak Hill Funeral Home. Not the diner, the funeral home. The moment they forced open the basement prep room door, the smell hit them. Heavy formaldehyde so thick it burned their eyes. Thomas Pendleton stood cornered near the crematory incinerator, but that wasn't what stopped the deputies cold. In the corner of the tiled prep room sat the missing chest freezer from the Rusty Spoon, still padlocked shut. One deputy cut the lock with bolt cutters. Inside, they discovered heavy medical waste bags filled with carefully harvested tissue and butchered meat cuts removed directly from corpses before cremation. The secret ingredient in Arthur Pendleton's famous Brunswick stew wasn't venison, or pork, or beef. It was human flesh. The poisoning victims had only become sick because Arthur accidentally used tissue from a recently embalmed body before enough chemicals had dissipated. The psychological fallout devastated Blackwood. You have to understand, this wasn't some anonymous city, it was a tight-knit rural community. Families had eaten at Arthur's diner for decades. Post-church lunches, birthday dinners, Little League celebrations, Friday night comfort food. Then suddenly, people realized they may have unknowingly consumed the remains of neighbors, friends, possibly even relatives. David Hiller eventually took indefinite leave from his position. According to coworkers, he suffered panic attacks whenever he walked through grocery store meat aisles afterward. The Rusty Spoon was permanently shut down and boarded over, left abandoned beside Route 9 like a scar nobody wanted to look at. But honestly, the final detail is the one investigators still struggle to forget. During Arthur Pendleton's trial, prosecutors eventually asked the obvious question, why? Was this all really just about saving money on meat? Arthur sat calmly at the defense table, wearing the same gentle smile customers remembered from the diner. Then he leaned toward the microphone and answered softly. Beef gets tough. Pork gets greasy. A pause. If you want stew that melts in your mouth, you have to use the right cuts. And the truly horrifying part? Investigators could only prove the brothers' operation had existed for roughly 2 years. But Arthur's award-winning Brunswick stew recipe had been served at the Rusty Spoon since 1978. The Gainesville Shadow, the true origins of a slasher. Pop culture has a way of sanitizing real life. When most people think of the horror classic time Scream, they picture popcorn, jump scares, and a guy in a mass-produced Halloween mask taunting teenagers over a landline. It's fun. It's safe. But the real story, the actual events that made a young writer named Kevin Williamson lock all his doors and windows one night in 1990 while watching a TV special, didn't have a slick soundtrack or a neatly tied-up ending. It was quiet, it was sweaty, and it was horrifyingly real. Let's go back to late August, 1990. Gainesville, Florida. Honestly, if you've ever been to North Florida in August, you know exactly what the atmosphere is like. The humidity is oppressive. The air is so thick, it feels like you're breathing through a hot, wet towel. You have the constant droning hum of cicadas in the oak trees and the rattling of cheap window AC units struggling to keep up with the heat. It was move-in week at the University of Florida. The town was buzzing with the chaotic energy of thousands of students returning for the fall semester. People were dragging heavy, awkward futons up narrow stairwells, eating leftover takeout pizza out of cardboard boxes, and sifting through piles of junk mail they didn't ask for. It's a very specific, mundane kind of joy. The messy reality of starting over. In a ground floor unit at the Williamsburg Village Apartments, one 8-year-old Sonia Larson and one 7-year-old Christina Powell were doing exactly that. They were freshmen, best friends from high school, just trying to settle in to their first taste of real independence. You know that feeling? The exhaustion of unpacking, the excitement of organizing a tiny closet, deciding where to put the TV. At the time, they were just two tired girls ready for the semester to begin. Now, at this point, everything feels perfectly safe. When you're a teenager in a bustling college town, surrounded by your peers, you feel insulated. You don't question the structural integrity of a cheap sliding glass door. You don't think twice about the dense, overgrown strip of woods just behind the apartment complex parking lot. Which actually mattered later. Because just beyond the tree line, hidden among the dense palmettos and draped Spanish moss, someone had quietly set up a campsite. First, the disturbances were completely microscopic. The kind of things anyone would naturally ignore. A faint rustling in the brush near the edge of the property line at dusk. A shadow shifting just outside the glow of the amber parking lot lights. If you're a student taking out the trash late at night, you might pause for a second. You might feel a brief, irrational prickle of fear on the back of your neck. But human nature kicks in. You rationalize it. You tell yourself it's just a stray dog looking for scraps, or the wind, or your own exhausted brain playing tricks on you. You shrug it off, turn around, and go back inside to the safety of your living room. But the man sitting in those woods wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a theatrical movie villain. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a transient, a drifter with a deeply disturbed mind, sitting in the sweltering heat, drinking stale water and sweating through his clothes. He wasn't just resting in the trees. He was watching. He was patiently studying the routines of the girls in the ground floor apartment, learning exactly when their lights went out and noticing just how vulnerable a simple glass door could really be. The transition from an ordinary August night to a living nightmare didn't happen with a cinematic jump scare. It started with a mechanical click. Down in Florida, those cheap sliding glass doors on ground floor apartments are notorious. If you know what you're doing, you don't even need to break the glass. You just wedge a tool under the frame, and silently pry the door up, right off its aluminum tracks. And honestly, if you're a teenager asleep in the next room with a cheap box fan humming loudly to fight off the suffocating late summer heat, you're never going to hear it. By the time the sun came up on the 24th of August, 1990, the Williamsburg Village apartments looked exactly the same as they had the day before. Students were walking to class, carrying heavy backpacks, complaining about the humidity, and drinking terrible dining hall coffee. But Christina and Sonia's parents hadn't heard from them. You know that very specific kind of anxiety. At first, you downplay it. You tell yourself, they're just busy. They're exhausted from moving. They're out exploring the campus. But after hours of calling, listening to the phone ring endlessly until the answering machine clicks over, that tight, cold feeling in your chest starts to take over. A wellness check was eventually called in. And when the police finally forced their way into that ground floor apartment, they didn't find a stylized horror movie set. They found a reality so profoundly gruesome, so methodically violent, that seasoned detectives had to immediately step back outside into the muggy parking lot just to catch their breath and process what they were looking at. Now, at this point, the police try to keep things quiet. That's standard procedure. You don't want to start a panic in a densely populated college town. They logically assumed this was a targeted attack. Maybe an aggrieved ex-boyfriend, or a localized burglary that had gone horribly, violently wrong. A terrible, but isolated, tragedy. But before they could even finish processing the scene, the bottom fell out of the investigation. The very next day, a 8-year-old student named Krista Hoyt didn't show up for her shift at the local sheriff's office. Police went to her duplex to check on her. Inside, they found a scene that completely shattered their initial theories. The killer hadn't just murdered Krista, he had taken his time, meticulously posing her body in a highly theatrical, deeply disturbed manner designed specifically to shock and traumatize whoever found her. Panic set in. Not a metaphorical panic, a suffocating, contagious fear that paralyzed the entire city of Gainesville. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, pepper spray, and baseball bats in a matter of hours. Students dragged their mattresses out of their bedrooms and into the center of their living rooms, sleeping in terrified groups of 10 with the lights blazing. And honestly, it was justified. Because just 2 days later, 2 more students, Manny Tabawada and Tracy Pales, were found dead in their apartment. The procedural messiness of a real investigation is that when you have a desperate, terrified public, you desperately need a suspect. The pressure from the media and the community is crushing. And almost immediately, the police found someone who fit the bill. His name was Edward Humphrey. He was an 8-year-old student who actually lived in the same apartment complex as 2 of the victims. He had a deeply scarred face from a car accident, suffered from severe, untreated mental health struggles, and had recently been acting incredibly erratic, getting into shouting matches and wandering the complex at odd hours. He was the quintessential creepy guy that neighbors whisper about. It was the perfect narrative. The town latched onto it immediately. This times was the monster. It was a false explanation, but it made total sense to a terrified community. They had a troubled, violent kid in custody, the police were publicly focusing all their energy on him, and people finally let out a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. Except, it wasn't over at all. Because as the detectives sat in their cramped, stale-smelling precinct offices, drinking day-old coffee and sifting through the horrific crime scene photos, the truth began to quietly collapse around them. The brutality of the murders, the sheer physical strength required to overpower someone like Manny Tabawada, who was a muscular college football prospect, combined with the meticulous, almost clinical cleanup of the crime scenes, did not match the profile of an erratic, disorganized teenager having a manic episode. The killer had used tape to bind his victims. He had left almost no usable fingerprints. He was literally washing his victims in the bathtub to destroy forensic evidence before slipping back into the night. Edward Humphrey was a tragic kid who desperately needed psychiatric help, but he wasn't a calculated, phantom-like predator. The chilling realization slowly washed over the task force. which actually mattered later because it meant all their early momentum was completely wasted. They had the wrong guy. And the man who had been patiently watching from the tree line, drinking stale water and quietly testing sliding glass doors, was entirely unknown to them. And he was still out there. The break in the case didn't come from a brilliant psychological profile or some cinematic shootout in the rain. It came from something painfully, frustratingly mundane. Just a few weeks later, and about 40 miles south in Ocala, a local guy tried to rob a grocery store. He botched it, fled in a stolen car, and ended up crashing. The local cops arrested him without much fanfare. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a 6-year-old drifter from Louisiana with a history of petty crime and an incredibly troubled past. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Now, at this point, nobody in Marion County thought they had just arrested the Gainesville Ripper. Why would they? He was just another sweaty, desperate guy in a holding cell, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, probably smelling like stale cigarettes and nervous sweat. At the time, this didn't seem strange. It was just another Tuesday night. Arrest is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. But back in Gainesville, the task force was finally making a physical breakthrough. Behind the university campus, hidden in a dense, humid patch of woods that students walked past every single day without a second thought, police found a campsite. It wasn't some high-tech villain's lair. It was pathetically ordinary. A damp tent, some cheap stolen tools, half-eaten junk food wrappers, and a battery-powered cassette recorder. It was the messy, dirty reality of a serial killer. He hadn't been an untouchable mastermind. He had been living in the dirt, wiping his hands on his jeans, and quietly peering through the trees at the brightly lit apartment windows. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. When crime scene technicians processed that damp campsite, they found evidence directly linking the camper to the Gainesville murders. And when they ran the serial numbers on the stolen items, it connected straight to the man sitting in the Ocala jail for a botched grocery store robbery. Danny Rolling is less than BR, is greater than, is less than. BR is greater than. The reveal of Danny Rolling completely shattered the illusion that monsters look like monsters. He was just a guy. And honestly, that was the hardest thing for the community to process. The emotional aftermath in Gainesville wasn't just heavy grief. It was a profound, lingering paranoia. For months afterward, students couldn't look at a sliding glass door without checking the locking mechanism 3 times. They couldn't walk past a line of trees on their way to class without wondering who was standing just out of sight, listening to the crunch of their footsteps. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But the final, truly haunting detail of this case, the aftershock that still echoes into pop culture today, came from that battery-powered cassette recorder found in his dirty tent. Rolling had recorded a tape for his family. On it, amidst rambling, self-pitying apologies and weirdly casual singing, he left an auditory footprint of a man who had completely detached from his own humanity. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. A few years later, a struggling screenwriter named Kevin Williamson was watching a television special about Danny Rolling. It was late at night. The sheer, grounded terror of the Gainesville Ripper, the idea of a killer just watching through the window of a normal, quiet house, observing your mundane evening routine, creeped Williamson out so much that he paused the TV and went to check his own locks. As he walked through his house, he noticed an open window in his living room. He stared at it, frozen, realizing in a cold sweat how easily someone could just slip inside while he was sitting on the couch. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. That exact feeling of domestic, helpless terror inspired him to sit down and write a script. He called it Scream. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. And it's a deeply uncomfortable realization when you sit with it. We watch movies like Scream for a fun, thrilling scare, eating popcorn with our friends while a masked phantom stalks teenagers on screen. But the genesis of that phantom wasn't a fun Hollywood trope. It was a very real, very sweaty drifter, crouching in the damp Florida woods, patiently waiting for a tired college kid to forget to lock their sliding glass door. And knowing that is infinitely more terrifying. Splintered, the Staten Island House of Horrors. You know, when detectives talk about a messy crime scene, they usually mean a struggle, a knocked-over lamp, a rug pushed out of place, maybe some blood spatter on the baseboards. But the two-story vinyl-sided house on Elmwood Park Drive in Staten Island wasn't just messy, it was excavated. End drywall was ripped out in jagged 3-foot chunks. The stuffing from the living room sofa was piled up like freshly fallen snow. Floorboards, solid oak floorboards, had been pried up with what looked like a heavy iron crowbar. And in the center of it all lay 5'8" Diane Gallagher. N.N. And honestly, the detectives standing in that suffocatingly hot room in mid-July weren't just asking who killed Diane. They were looking at the shredded walls, the smashed ceramic tiles, the absolute frantic destruction of a quiet middle-class home, and asking, what on earth were they looking for? N.N. But before we step inside that house, we need to understand who Diane was. Because the brutality of the scene just doesn't match the reality of her life. And Diane was a fixture in Great Kills, a quiet, working-class neighborhood on Staten Island's South Shore. She was a retired pediatric nurse, 58 years old. She had lived in that same house for almost 30 years. Her husband, Tom, had passed away from cancer 5 years prior. And since then, it was just her and a golden retriever named Buster. N.N. Her life was built on comfortable, mundane routines. She was the kind of neighbor who knew exactly when the street sweeper came by. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd walk Buster down to the corner, holding a large Dunkin' iced coffee. Her neighbors knew her schedule down to the minute. You'd hear the distant, steady hum of traffic from Highland Boulevard, the occasional roar of a lawnmower, the thud of the morning paper hitting the driveway. She was the neighbor who would grab your Amazon packages and put them behind your planter so they wouldn't get stolen. She was safe. She was deeply, profoundly normal. None, which brings us to Tuesday, August 12th. None. It's about 85 degrees out with that thick, oppressive East Coast humidity that makes the air feel heavy in your lungs. It's 4 p.m. Diane's next-door neighbor, a retired sanitation worker named Mike, is out front wrestling with a tangled garden hose. And he happens to glance over at Diane's driveway. Her silver Honda CR-V is parked there, right where it always is. But something is off. N. And at first, it's just a tiny detail, a minor glitch in the suburban matrix. Diane's trash cans are still sitting at the curb. The garbage truck came through at 10 a.m. Diane, times never times, leaves her cans out past noon. She was meticulous about it. N. Mike wipes the sweat off his forehead and walks over to pull the cans up her driveway. And that's when he notices the front door. N. It's open. Not wide open. Just cracked, maybe 2 or 3 inches. A stack of mail, junk mail, mostly, a couple of Valpak coupons, and a utility bill is wedged in the brass slot, fluttering slightly in the sluggish summer breeze. N. Mike stops. The neighborhood is suddenly very quiet. The hum of the traffic seems to fade into the background. He calls out her name. Diane? Nothing. At that point, it made sense to just assume she left it open for a breeze, or maybe she was in the backyard. People don't immediately jump to murder. We rationalize. We tell ourselves, it's nothing. N. But as Mike walks up the 3 concrete steps to her porch and pushes that heavy wooden door open, the first thing that hits him isn't a sight. It's a smell. A thick, suffocating wave of raw plaster dust, stale air, and the sharp, undeniable metallic scent of blood. Mike didn't want to step any further inside. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around, go back to his driveway, and call 911. But he had known Diane for 20 years. So he took a breath, pushed the door open a few more inches, and stepped into the foyer. The first thing he registered was the sound. It was the frantic, muffled scratching of dog paws coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Buster. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. What Mike saw didn't make sense. It was as if a localized tornado had touched down exclusively inside Diane's living room. The floral sofa, the one she kept meticulously vacuumed, was gutted. Foam stuffing was scattered across the hardwood floor like dirty snow. But it was the walls that made Mike freeze. The drywall had been ripped open. Huge, jagged sections of sheetrock were torn down to the wooden studs, exposing the pink fiberglass insulation and electrical wiring underneath. And then he looked down the hallway. Diane was lying near the entrance to the kitchen. We won't dwell on the gruesome details of the scene, but suffice it to say, it was immediately clear that she was gone. The violence inflicted upon her was staggering, completely incongruous with the quiet, sun-drenched suburban street outside. Mike stumbled backward, his heavy work boots crunching over chunks of plaster. He barely made it to the porch before he pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. When the NYPD from the 122nd Precinct arrived, they taped off the perimeter, pushing the growing crowd of whispering neighbors back behind the police cruisers. Detectives stepped into the house, and immediately they formed a working theory. At that point, it made perfect sense. Staten Island, like a lot of American suburbs, was quietly battling a brutal opioid epidemic. Property crimes, specifically aggressive home invasions, had seen a sharp uptick. Junkies breaking in, looking for cash, jewelry, or prescription painkillers. It was a tragic, but common, narrative. The working theory was simple. A burglar breaks into the house, thinking it's empty. They are desperate, maybe high, tearing the place apart in a frantic search for a hidden safe or a stash of valuables. Diane comes home from her morning walk with Buster, catches the intruder in the act, and the burglar panics. It's a burglary gone horribly, tragically wrong. It's a neat explanation. It gives the chaos a shape. It's the kind of story that makes the neighbors lock their doors a little tighter at night, but ultimately lets them sleep, believing it was just a random, unlucky encounter. But honestly, the longer the crime scene investigators stayed in that house, the more that theory began to disintegrate. It started with the small things. The artifacts of the investigation that just didn't line up. If this was a desperate junkie tearing the house apart for quick cash, why was Diane's purse sitting right there on the kitchen island? Inside it, investigators found her wallet, completely untouched, with $400 in crisp $20 bills. They moved to the bedroom. Diane's jewelry box was sitting open on her dresser. Inside, her diamond engagement ring and a heavy gold necklace were sitting right on top. On the desk in the corner, a brand new $2,000 MacBook Pro was resting in plain sight. A panicked burglar doesn't leave behind untraceable cash and high-end electronics. And then there was the destruction itself. When the adrenaline faded and the detectives really looked at the damage, the frantic search theory completely collapsed. The walls weren't just smashed in a blind rage. When you looked closely at the edges of the ruined drywall, you could see straight, deliberate lines. Someone hadn't just taken a hammer to the walls, they had used a utility knife to score the sheetrock before prying it away in neat 3-foot sections. In the master bedroom, the heavy oak floorboards hadn't been randomly splintered. Someone had taken a crowbar and methodically popped them up one by one, exposing the subfloor beneath. This wasn't a frantic, panicked search. This was an excavation. Someone had spent hours in this house, dismantling it piece by piece. Which brings us to the most chilling detail of all. The detail that completely shatters the idea of a panicked intruder. When officers finally located Buster, the golden retriever, he wasn't cowering under a bed or injured. He was locked safely inside the downstairs half-bathroom. And sitting right next to him on the tile floor was a freshly filled bowl of water. A desperate burglar doesn't pause a frenzied home invasion to make sure the family dog is hydrated. The realization settled over the detectives like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The killer hadn't been surprised by Diane. They had dealt with Diane first. And then, with the homeowner dead on the floor and the dog safely locked away, they took their time. They weren't looking for cash. They were looking for something hidden inside the very bones of the house. And whatever it was, Diane had died because of it. When crime scene unit technicians finally peeled back the rest of the splintered drywall in the master bedroom, they found it. A rectangular cavity, exactly 14.5 inches wide, sitting flush between two wooden 2x4 studs. There were fresh scrape marks on the surrounding wood. 4 heavy-duty lag bolts lay discarded on the subfloor. Someone hadn't just been looking for something. They had known exactly what was there, a hidden wall safe. Detectives brought Diane's daughter, Emily, into the precinct. They asked her about the safe. Emily looked confused. She explained that her father, a retired Staten Island sanitation worker who passed away 5 years earlier, had installed a safe in the late 90s. He was an old-school guy who didn't entirely trust banks. He used to joke at family barbecues that his real retirement fund was in the walls. But Emily told them something else. Diane had emptied that safe years ago. She had moved the money into a mutual fund shortly after her husband died. So, who still thought the money was there? Who knew the exact layout of the house? And, more importantly, who did Buster the Golden Retriever know well enough to let them lock him in a bathroom without barking his head off and alerting the neighbors? It wasn't a sophisticated forensic dragnet that broke the case, it was a smudge. A single partial thumbprint lifted from the rim of Buster's stainless steel water bowl. When they ran it through the system, it didn't ping a career burglar or a desperate drifter. It pinged a 8-year-old local guy with a minor DUI record. His name was Tommy. He was Diane's nephew. And honestly, that's when the reality of this case shifts from a terrifying home invasion to something so much darker, because it means the killer didn't break in. He was invited. Let's reconstruct that Tuesday morning. Tommy knocks on the door around 9 a.m. Diane smiles, opens it, and lets her nephew in. We know this because investigators found a second coffee mug sitting in the kitchen sink, still containing a splash of French vanilla creamer, Diane's favorite. They sat at the kitchen island, they drank coffee. And at some point, Tommy, who had been quietly spiraling into gambling debt, asked for a loan. When Diane refused, the nephew she had babysat, the kid she bought Christmas presents for, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. He didn't hesitate. After Diane fell, Tommy didn't panic. He calmly walked Buster to the half bath. He filled the water bowl, leaving that single thumbprint behind. And then he went out to his truck, grabbed his utility knife and a crowbar, and spent 3 hours methodically tearing his aunt's house apart, looking for a ghost fortune. For the family, Tommy's arrest wasn't a relief. It was a second death. The quiet Staten Island neighborhood where Diane lived, the kind of place where people leave their garage doors open and everyone knows everyone was fundamentally shattered. Emily didn't just lose her mother. She realized she had been sitting across the Thanksgiving table from her mother's murderer. The trial was a quiet, suffocating affair. Tommy sat there, staring blankly at the defense table, barely looking up when the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But there is one final detail about this case. A detail that stays with the detectives long after the file was boxed up and sent to the archives. When police executed a search warrant on Tommy's apartment, they found the wall safe in his garage. He had used an angle grinder to cut through the heavy steel door. The detectives looked inside, expecting to find something. But they found exactly what Emily had told them they would find. It was completely empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a small faded Polaroid photograph of Diane and her late husband tucked into the back corner. Tommy had murdered his aunt, dismantled her home, and destroyed his entire family for a metal box containing absolutely nothing. The $10,000 ghost. If you ask an attorney about the weirdest thing a client has ever handed them, you'll usually hear stories about strange family heirlooms, or maybe a messy confession scrawled on a bar napkin. But for Marcus Reed, a painfully ordinary estate lawyer working out of a faded brick office park in Dayton, Ohio, the answer is always the same. It was a Tuesday afternoon, October 14th. The air conditioning in Marcus's office had been rattling all morning, and he was halfway through a stale cup of break room coffee, absent-mindedly sorting through the daily stack of junk mail. That's when the courier arrived. He dropped a heavy manila envelope on Marcus's desk. Inside was a cashier's check for exactly $10,000 and a smaller sealed black envelope. Clipped to the front was a handwritten post-it note. It read, Marcus. Do not open the black envelope until you see my name in the obituaries. When that happens, use this money to find out who killed me. The note was signed by Elias Thorne. And honestly, the most disturbing part of this entire situation wasn't just the message itself. It was the fact that Elias Thorne had been sitting in Marcus's office just 3 days prior, perfectly healthy, making awkward small talk about the weather while signing some routine living trust documents. Music. To understand how we get to that sealed black envelope, we have to go back about 6 months. Back to a very quiet, very normal suburban street. Elias Thorne was 58 years old, and by all accounts, he was a ghost of a man. I don't mean that in a spooky way. I just mean he was completely invisible to the world. He was a senior auditor for a regional logistics firm. He drove a beige 2014 Honda Accord. He lived alone in a modest, single-story ranch house at the end of a cul-de-sac, having amicably divorced over a decade ago. His life was governed by a strict, almost suffocating routine. Thursdays at 6 p.m., he bought groceries. Saturdays at 8 a.m., he washed the Accord. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He didn't have hidden gambling debts. He was just a quiet man who liked to read historical biographies on his back patio while listening to the distant, rhythmic ticking of his neighbor's sprinkler system. Which is why, when Elias first started feeling like something was wrong, he didn't tell anyone. At least, not yet. Now, at this point, if you or I thought someone was watching us, we might call the police, or at least mention it to a friend. But Elias was an auditor. He dealt in probabilities and cold, hard facts. And the probability of someone targeting a painfully average 8-year-old man was statistically 0. So, he rationalized it. The first disturbance happened in early May. Elias woke up on a Tuesday morning, went into his master bathroom, and froze. His bottle of daily allergy medication, which he rigidly kept on the far left side of the medicine cabinet, label facing perfectly forward, was sitting on the right side of the bottom shelf. Lying on its side. And honestly, most people wouldn't even register that. A misplaced bottle. Big deal. But Elias did. He stood there in the dead quiet of his bathroom, the hum of the fluorescent vanity light buzzing above him, and he just stared at it. He tried to mentally retrace his steps. Had he been tired the night before? Had he bumped it while reaching for the toothpaste? He stood there for a long time, feeling the cold tile under his bare feet, trying to force a logical explanation into his brain. Eventually, he sighed, picked up the bottle, and put it back in its proper place. He told himself he was just getting older. His memory was slipping. Which, if we're being fair, is exactly what any rational person would think. It happens to everyone. But then, 2 weeks later, it was the porch light. Elias came home from a late shift at work around 9:30 p.m. It was raining one of those miserable, slow, freezing drizzles. He pulled into his driveway and noticed the front porch was pitch black. He assumed the bulb had finally burned out. But when he unlocked the front door, set his damp briefcase down, and reached up into the fixture to change it, the bulb wasn't dead. It had been unscrewed. Just half a turn. Just enough to break the electrical connection. Elias stood on his porch in the freezing rain, his fingers gripping the damp glass of the light bulb. He looked out into the darkness of his front yard, listening to the rain hissing against the pavement. He didn't see anyone out there. He didn't hear any footsteps. But in that moment, a deep, primal knot of dread settled into his stomach. Someone had been on his porch. Someone had purposely plunged his entryway into darkness. At the time, this didn't seem like the start of a sophisticated murder plot. It felt like a cruel prank. Maybe bored teenagers from the neighborhood casing houses? That's what he told his coworker the next day in the break room while pouring a cup of coffee. He laughed it off. He downplayed it. Because that's what we do. We try to convince ourselves we aren't in danger. But by August, the quiet, mundane disturbances had escalated into something impossible to ignore. And Elias Thorne, the man who lived his entire life by the numbers, realized the odds were finally catching up to him. He was absolutely convinced someone was going to murder him. He just needed to figure out how to prove it after he was gone. By mid-August, these subtle, deniable things gave way to aggressive, undeniable intrusions. It wasn't just unscrewed light bulbs anymore. Elias started coming home to an empty house that didn't feel empty. On Tuesday, August 14th, he walked into his living room and found the air conditioning cranked down to 60 degrees. Elias was a man who hated the cold. He always kept the thermostat strictly at 72. 2 days later, he found a faint, muddy footprint on the linoleum near the back door. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than, now. At this point, you might be screaming at your screen, asking why he didn't just call the police. Well, he did. But real life isn't an action movie. When the patrol officers showed up, they stood in his kitchen, smelling of stale coffee and damp uniforms, and looked at the smudged dirt on the floor. They pointed out that Elias lived alone, he had a habit of leaving his gardening shoes by the door, and there was absolutely zero sign of forced entry. They took a report, but Elias could see the look they exchanged. That polite, weary look cops give when they think they're dealing with a lonely guy losing his grip on reality is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And honestly, that was the most terrifying part for Elias. No one believed him. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. So, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Elias walked into the law office of Arthur Vance, a local estate attorney he had known for a decade. The office was quiet, the only sound, the steady ticking of a wall clock and the hum of traffic outside. Elias looked exhausted. His clothes were rumpled, and he hadn't shaved. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase and placed a manila envelope on the polished mahogany desk, right next to Arthur's half-eaten turkey sandwich. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. Keep this in escrow, Elias told him, his voice trembling but deadly serious. When they find me dead, I don't want you to trust the police. I want you to use this money to hire a private investigator. You find out who did it. A is less than BR is greater than is less than. BR is greater than Arthur just stared at him. He tried to reason with Elias. He asked him if he was sleeping, if he had seen a doctor recently. Because, from the outside, the explanation for all of this seemed tragically simple. The false explanation that everyone from the police to his neighbors to his own lawyer silently agreed upon. Elias Thorne, a 4-year-old divorced man living alone, was suffering from a severe, early-onset paranoid breakdown. His family had a history of dementia. The misplaced mouthwash, the thermostat, the paranoia, it all fit the clinical profile of a mind turning against itself. Arthur took the check, but purely to humor him, hoping it would give Elias some peace of mind. At least, not yet knowing how wrong he was, is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Arthur assumed the crisis had passed. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Then came September 9th. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. It was an unusually hot Monday. Elias's next-door neighbor noticed that Elias's mail had been spilling out of the roadside mailbox since Thursday. His car was still in the driveway. The neighbor walked over, knocked on the door, and noticed a strange metallic smell lingering near the garage. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The police arrived at 2:15 p.m. They found Elias Thorne dead in the front seat of his sedan, parked inside his closed garage. The keys were in the ignition. The gas tank was empty. The initial ruling was exactly what everyone expected: suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. A tragic, logical end to a man's rapid mental decline. It was a neat, tidy explanation that closed the case before it even opened. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The truth had seemingly collapsed into a sad, mundane statistic. Is less than BR is greater than BR. Is less than BR is greater than BR. Arthur felt a terrible wave of guilt. He sat in his office, looking at the check still sitting in his safe. wondering if he could have done more to get Elias psychiatric help. He prepared to transfer the funds back to Elias's modest estate. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But 3 days later, the mail arrived. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Arthur's secretary dropped a small, padded yellow envelope on his desk. It was postmarked Wednesday, September 4th, the day before Elias supposedly drove his car into a closed garage and took his own life. Arthur opened it with a silver letter opener. Inside was a single cheap plastic flash drive and a handwritten note on a torn piece of legal paper. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. The note said, Arthur, I don't know how to drive a manual transmission. Check the car. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Arthur froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He immediately picked up the phone and called the detective who had signed off on the scene. He asked one question. What kind of car was Elias found in? Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The detective shuffled through his notes. A 2008 Honda Civic, the detective replied. 5-speed stick shift, is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. In an instant, the tidy explanation of a tragic suicide shattered. The walls of Arthur's quiet office suddenly felt like they were closing in. Elias Thorne hadn't killed himself. He had been murdered, staged to look like a suicide, by someone who made one tiny, critical mistake. They used Elias's project car, a car he had bought to restore but physically didn't know how to drive. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than, and now Arthur had $10,000 to hunt a ghost. Now at this point, Arthur didn't call the police back right away. And honestly, I don't blame him. He just hung up the phone, locked his office door, and stared at that cheap plastic flash drive sitting on his desk. The hum of the building's air conditioning suddenly felt incredibly loud. It was 6 p.m. on a Friday. The cleaning staff was vacuuming somewhere down the hall, a completely mundane sound, while Arthur sat alone, realizing he was holding the digital remains of a man who had choreographed his own murder investigation. He poured himself a cup of stale, tepid coffee from the break room, more for the familiar routine of it than anything else, and sat back down. He plugged the drive into his laptop. There was no dramatic encryption, just a folder containing 2 PDF documents and 1 MP4 video file. Arthur clicked the PDFs first. They were bank statements from Elias's primary savings account. Highlighted in bright digital yellow were dozens of withdrawals over the last 8 months. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, but escalating rapidly. They were checks written to cash. The signatures looked like Elias's, but they were a little too perfect. A total of $142,000 had been quietly siphoned away. Next to the statements was a scanned copy of a municipal property line agreement from 3 years prior. The signature on the agreement was a perfect, identical match to the forged checks. It belonged to Greg Miller, Elias's next-door neighbor. The same concerned neighbor who had found Elias's body and called the police. Arthur's stomach dropped. He clicked on the video file. It was time-stamped Thursday, September 5th at 4:15 p.m., less than 24 hours before Greg supposedly found Elias dead. It was footage from a hidden camera, likely shoved inside a hollowed-out radio or a bookshelf in Elias's kitchen. And you have to understand, watching this footage, it wasn't a movie. There was no tense soundtrack, just the low mechanical drone of Elias's refrigerator and the grainy, washed-out lighting of a late afternoon. Elias was sitting at his kitchen table. He looked exhausted, pale. He was staring at the wall, just waiting. Then there's a knock on the back door. Greg walks in. He's wearing a gray fleece vest and holding a Tupperware container. "Brought you some of that stew, Eli," Greg says. His voice is perfectly friendly. Warm, even. He's the picture of a helpful suburban neighbor checking on the crazy old man next door. They talk for a few minutes about the weather, about the yard. It is sickeningly normal. Then Greg offers to make them both some instant coffee. Elias nods. When Elias turns his head to cough, Greg casually reaches into his fleece vest, pulls out a small prescription bottle, and dumps a heavy dose of crushed powder into Elias's mug. He stirs it with a spoon, taps the spoon on the rim times clink, clink times, and sets it down in front of Elias. Arthur found himself holding his breath, leaning closer to the monitor. Elias looks down at the mug. He sits there, in silence, for a long time. And this is the part that would haunt Arthur for the rest of his life. Because looking at the footage, you can see it in Elias's eyes. He knows. He knows exactly what is in that cup. He knows Greg has been stealing from him. He knows Greg has been gaslighting him, moving his keys, making him look insane to the rest of the world so no one would believe him when the money went missing. Elias looks up from the mug, and for just a fraction of a second, he makes dead eye contact with the hidden camera lens across the room. Then, he picks up the coffee, and he drinks it. Within 20 minutes, Elias slumps forward onto the table, completely unconscious. The heavy, dead weight of his body makes the wood creak. Greg doesn't panic. He doesn't cackle or act like a mastermind. He just finishes his own coffee, takes his mug to the sink, washes it, dries it with a towel, and puts it in the cabinet. Then he puts on a pair of leather gardening gloves, hooks his arms under Elias's armpits, and drags him out the door toward the garage. His rubber soles squeak slightly on the linoleum. And that was it. The video ended. Arthur sat in the dark. The truth of the reconstruction collapsed over him like a ton of bricks. Greg dragged Elias out to the garage to stage a suicide. He saw the Honda Civic, put Elias in the driver's seat, turned the key, and closed the garage door. Carbon monoxide would take care of the rest. It was a tidy, tragic end that the police bought without a second thought. But Greg made a mistake. He didn't know Elias's left knee had been completely shattered in a workplace accident decades ago. Elias physically could not press a clutch pedal. He hadn't been able to drive a manual transmission in 30 years. Greg just saw a car and used it, unknowingly sealing his own fate with a 2,000-pound mechanical alibi. Arthur called the police. The detective drove over that night to collect the flash drive. The emotional aftermath of the case was remarkably quiet. There was no grand shootout. When the police went to arrest Greg Miller on Saturday morning, he was standing in his driveway in his slippers, taking out the recycling. He looked confused, then resigned. Just a greedy, mundane man who realized he'd been outsmarted by the ghost he had created. For weeks, Arthur felt a profound, lingering sadness. Elias wasn't paranoid. He was a man drowning in plain sight, forced to fund his own post-mortem investigation because the world had already written him off as crazy. But the final aftershock, the detail that kept Arthur awake at night, came 2 months later while he was finalizing the paperwork for Elias's estate. Arthur was looking at the original $10,000 cashier's check Elias had given him. He noted the issue date, August 1st. Just to be thorough, Arthur cross-referenced it with the DMV title records for the 2008 Honda Civic sitting in Elias's garage. Elias had purchased the car on August 2nd for exactly $1,200. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He sat back in his chair as the true timeline clicked into place. Elias hadn't just bought a project car by accident. He had purposefully bought a manual transmission car a full month in advance. He parked it in his garage and deliberately let the gas tank run near empty so it wouldn't run long enough to destroy the physical evidence inside the cabin. The $10,000 wasn't just to hire Arthur. It was a psychological anchor. Elias knew that if he paid a lawyer $10,000, the lawyer would feel obligated enough to actually look at the case file when he died. Elias Thorne hadn't just predicted his own murder. He had meticulously engineered the crime scene, bought his own coffin, left the keys in the ignition, and sat at his kitchen table, patiently waiting for his neighbor to put him inside.